Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca, all the way from Mexico City, with co-host, teacher and socialist Ante Lipson from Oakland, California. We're online at whatsappodcast.com. You can find that link to our site in the episode notes, wherever you found this episode. You can also find my personal social media handle as at Don Eduardo Barca. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. We have merch as well. If you fancy a shirt, contact us through our site at whatsleftpodcast.com. All right, thank you for that housekeeping. Jay is back with us, the founder of ADA and also host of Rising Sovereign podcast. And Andy will take it from here because I would like for you to elaborate a bit more, and then Jay will have us inform us since our last episode.
Yeah. So first up, again, welcome, Jay. I think it's been maybe almost a year and a half or 2 years since you were last on What's Left.
Seems about right.
Yeah, and it was with you and JD, and we actually had 2 episodes. One of them talking about your school, your homeschool there, Freedom School. I kind of thought about it with the Appalachian Academy of Therapeutic Arts that you and JD were doing together in North Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina. And then we had another episode talking about free births, something that JD was really passionate about, and you as well. And it's something I had never learned. Maybe it was even called primal births, if I got it right, or something like that.
A lot of terms in and around that, the whole birthing world.
Yeah. And then between that time when you recorded with us and now, a giant hurricane came through North Carolina and Asheville, and floods, and those really kind of famous floods. And I remember sending you all emails just being like, hey, are you okay? And not hearing anything and being actually really nervous. But, it took a while for you guys to be able to get to something where you could respond to things. And since then, I was like, I really like to know how you all were, hear about what actually took place. Like, you guys were on the ground there. And then obviously there was for us out here, there was a whole story about what was going on, the mainstream story, the independent story. But mostly I was just relieved to hear you were okay. And then since then, you have had to shut down your school. And that has got you today talking about your Rising Sovereign podcast and the journey you're on now. But I had asked, when I reached out to you and JD, I had said, I think we have 2 stories to tell here: what happened with that flood, and then where the journey you all have been on since then. And today I hope to talk more about the disaster, sure, and then how you all went through it. But anyway, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, good to be back with you guys.
Well, let's go ahead. Could you walk us back to just before the Hurricane Helene?
Yeah, Hurricane Helene. And there's different classifications, I guess, as it progresses through the water into the land and different things like that. But so it was right at the end of September, and we had actually had quite a few days of heavy rain. Not really heavy rain, but consistent rain leading up to that day. And then that night through the morning, the real strong weather came through. And one interesting thing that in my experience, so both myself and my 7-year-old, we're both like up really early in the morning, almost across the board. It's really hard to keep that kid in bed. He and I both slept through most of that morning. I was up before him. He slept till probably 10 o'clock, which is completely unheard of. Mm-hmm. So, and I bring that up because to me, it is potentially involves some sort of odd conditions, atmospheric, barometric, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Because that's really unheard of for that to happen for both of us.
Yeah.
So I woke up to JD. She had woken me up once during the night saying the winds are sounding really really scary. And, somehow I managed to go back to sleep.
Hmm.
Um, but I woke up in the morning and there was water coming down the mountain behind the house and actually going into the lower level of our house. So myself and my stepson got up and started digging and trenching and sandbagging and trying to divert the water away from the house, which we were able to do. But by that point, the road was well, we have a bridge that comes across the creek as our driveway. That had accumulated enough debris that it rerouted the water out onto the road.
Wow.
And there, it's a 2-lane road, like a kind of a 2-lane country road, but and I have seen it covered with water one time before, about 7 years ago. But my mother-in-law was actually out watching the road, and she came back and said the road is gone. And I was thinking, okay, well, I've seen this happen before. It's not that big of a deal. But by the time I was able to make it down there, you could actually see big chunks of asphalt. I mean, the road was completely washed out for a good portion of the road. I mean, it's probably about 2 miles down to the next road, and so maybe halfway back from there, it was really washed out, and it was just a raging river.
Wow.
So that was something that was beyond what I had ever experienced here, and it sort of was this slow motion coming to realize the magnitude of what had gone on. So at that point, it was like, okay, well, we can't get out anytime. We're not going to get out by vehicle anytime soon.
Yeah.
We have an old there's like old infrastructure from homesteading that happened on this piece of property back in probably like the late 1700s, 1800s. And so there is an old spring house, the remnants of an old spring house, which still runs. So that was kind of one of the first things that I was thinking we should make a trip out to the spring, see if the spring's running so that we can have access to water.
Hmm.
And so once we did, we set out and
And Jay, when we say we, the people involved in this, you, JD, and who else?
well, at this time, my stepson, who's uh, he's 19,
Okay.
he was with me, and so we went out to go survey the spring. And it was at that point that we realized that, additionally to the water and the flooding, there had been some incredibly severe winds. And so, the property that we live on, we butt up against national forest. It's a pretty good sized piece of property, but the amount of trees that were down on this property, I mean, are in the thousands.
Wow.
So to try and traverse through, because I'd say that the spring is maybe like a quarter mile away, and to get there was kind of an adventure. We had to climb under and over trees and things
Hmm.
like that, and just sort of taking in real time slowly the magnitude of what was going on, and then realized we could get to water. That was pretty much the first thing. Okay, so we know we have a water source. That was big. And then beginning to assess where things are at. And then there was, on our road, there are a lot of other people that live on our road, so starting to connect with people and then putting the pieces together. But it was this sort of surreal unfolding that happened that
Hmm.
morning.
And so it's the first morning after the hurricane, or the second morning where you're realizing there's something seriously going on, that like the road. Which morning was that?
That was the first morning.
First morning. Okay.
Yeah, so it was like overnight from, if I remember correctly, it was like a Thursday over Friday.
Okay.
And so Friday morning was when I woke up and we were mitigating water, realized the road was gone, realized we weren't going to be able to get out for a while. And, um, and then that began kind of taking stock of what we needed to have in place for just immediate stuff that we would need. and then starting to reach out and check in with various neighbors and things like that.
And doing that takes how much time?
I mean, that was like within the first 24 hours, I would say.
Yeah.
I started clearing. We have a four-wheeler, so I started cutting a trail to get out to the spring with the four-wheeler. I took a length of hose out there, started, brought some barrels to like direct water into so that we could begin that process. Water that can go real quick.
Yeah.
Need water. And we're on a well, but we need 240 volts to run the well, and so power was gone. Um, so we had
Right.
to make other,
Wow.
make other arrangements.
Yeah. Yeah. We only heard about it from the outside,
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
and so what are the things that you guys did successfully in the when in getting together with your neighbors and getting to the well? What were the things that you felt were crucial choices you made that made a difference in getting through this?
Sure. I mean, we had, I think part of the good fortune that we had was a couple of different things. I mean, being where we are, there was a lot that went into getting here and building our life around a land-based and nature-based lifestyle. And then our school was largely based on nature immersion. And we did do a lot of interacting with nature, including understanding how to do some of the primitive skills, understanding how to build fires and build shelters. And so there was a lot of interaction and familiarity with the certain things that the land is able to provide for you and what the essentials are for survival. So knowing that, having the ability to cook food and the ability to have water, which we were surrounded by wood. We have a lot of woods around us, and we have a lot of, like, I mean, with the spring, we had a good clean source of water. So, those were sort of things that had circumstantially been put in place. In the back of my mind, I had always thought of this area as being geologically stable in a way. And so that was something that had provided a sense of comfort for me. And then we did spend time putting certain things in place to have in the event of this type of thing. So we did have like a cache of food supplies and things that were dry. We have in our home a wood cook stove, so we can utilize that to like as an oven or as a cooktop
Right.
that runs on wood. So some of those things were already set in place that we fortunately had there. And the other thing is, we were very fortunate to not suffer any extreme home or life damage, loss of life or loss of property, like, physical dwellings, property. We were situated in such a way where we were really close to some of that, but it didn't actually directly affect us. So we had, you know, a a small hole in the roof that needed to be dealt with, um, and the roadways and the impeding us from getting out. But not far from here, there were people where their entire homes were being washed into the water, and so
Wow.
we were pretty close to that. Like we're within a mile or two of where we are. Some of that stuff was going on, and then into further into Swannanoa, there was a lot. And but see, at this point, we didn't really know what the extent was beyond our little holler here.
Right. Right.
And so we could walk on foot as far down the road as maybe three quarters of a mile. That's about as far as we could get at that point because it got a little too treacherous.
Treacherous in terms of water.
Well, there was water, and then where the road was, there was these big, just washed out, kind of like erosion pits, and
Yeah.
then there was sections where the road was still sort of intact, or like a piece of a small bridge was still there, and then trees were down power lines were down, and so getting through, it was sort of a little bit like you'd go a little ways on foot, you'd talk to a couple people, and they'd say, "Oh, I've been down this far," or "Have you talked to so and so?" And so those types of things are going on, but it was a sort of an incremental branching out a little bit further from where we were at the time. I think at some point we realized where the road was still intact, and it was maybe about a mile from here. And we also had another one of my stepsons was in town with one of our cars. So he was able to, once we were able to make contact with him, he was able to bring the car and leave it at the place where the road left off. I think maybe 4 days in, there was a father and two sons that ran a grading business. So they had a excavator and a couple of skid steers, and they came in overnight and they cut a little four-wheeler road all the way down to the end. So at that point I was, and so just to give you some context, like I live on the same property as my parents. They live like maybe 400 yards away in another house. And so at that point we were kind of burning through all of our perishables. They're in their mid 70s. So I was able to get them out and send them to California where my sister lives. And so they were able to get out and do that. And then we, continued to hold down the fort here. I mean, I have dogs, I have goats, I have chickens. So there was like a little bit less of an ability to just leave and go somewhere else.
Right.
And
how long? So how long for you as a saga for your family and the community there? How long does that period go? Is it like, okay, we got through 24, 48 hours and we're good? Or do things just, does the experience of having everything broken down for a while, does that become a week-long saga or even month-long saga in terms of?
It was probably around 3 weeks before we got, between 3 weeks and a month before we got power back on.
I was gonna get that.
Yeah.
Power outage, and how long?
Yeah.
3 weeks until you had power back on?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Electricity.
And at starting, once there was four-wheeler access, there was a lot of people coming and going. I mean, I helped some neighbors carry, gas cans from like a mile down the road just on foot. These were like, older neighbors, and I saw them carrying 2 5-gallons of gas each. And I was like, okay, I'm 25 years younger than you. Let me help you with this. And so there was a lot of people coming and going once there was access. And then as that progressed a little bit, it got to a point where there was a lot of people coming and going. There was a lot of four-wheelers. There was a lot of, relief efforts coming from all over the country.
Right.
I think one of the first crews that I saw was a 4 or 5 guys on foot that were firefighters from Chicago. And they had, saw the situation, and they all got in their vehicles and traveled up here. And there was some really some interesting things that happened as a result of this. I mean, it was, it was a very surreal and anomalous type of thing to live through. And I think from the outside, it was seemingly a lot more intense and extreme, at least from our perspective, because like I said, we didn't wash away in a river.
Right.
But when I finally got to town and talked to a number of people. I talked to like my sister, my uncle, some of my friends, and they all burst into tears.
Right.
Because they were fearing the worst. And so from our perspective, it was like we were living through it in real time. And although it was surreal and intense at times, there wasn't the same level of speculation and unknowing.
Mm-hmm. Well, because you were the ones going through it.
Right.
Right. And it seemed like while you were seeing some things you had never seen before, I don't know, would you describe yourself? What would be the emotional state you're going through most of the time? Anxiety, determination? Like what are you going through when you're seeing things that are threatening? A little nerve,
Mhm.
a little nerve make a person anxious. Certainly, to hear about it, I'm anxious.
Right.
How would you describe the kind of emotional state that you were going through during those days?
I mean, it was so surreal in the beginning, and then I think there was this sort of slow dawning on us of what the magnitude was. Like I said, we didn't really find out how far reaching things were until several days after, and then finally getting into town and connecting with some people, in other places or outside world, and getting more of the full picture. But I think that I have a little bit of a, I don't know, apocalyptic mentality. I have for a long time. And so there's a part of me that's in the back of my mind, always kind of waiting for something like that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
This wouldn't have been something that I would have expected in this way, but there is a part of me that, and I think, I connected with a lot of people in the neighborhood and in the area, that a lot of people that actually really felt like they came alive and had a different sense of purpose and meaning, and it did really seem to get a lot of us in touch with not only each other but parts of ourselves that, we needed to be reminded of.
Can you talk more about that? Because I'm interested in the communal experience that came as a result of this. It's something I'd heard about when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, when people
Hmm.
were trying to like, again, let's put aside what FEMA and things like that, but
Sure.
people trying to figure out how to make their way. We're finding like there were stories of like all sorts of, people. It wasn't like Hunger Games where people were like, that's my food.
Right.
Da, 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 da. It was very
Right.
much almost naturally collaborative, even if there seemed like there might not be enough. So I'm wondering if you had a similar experience or what kind of communal experience you had out of this.
Absolutely. I mean, looking back at, it's kind of funny that with some of the things like supplies and, water, and some of the basic, food rations or like toilet paper or things like that. Looking back at the last time we faced something that was on a large magnitude was like 2020, where there was, this like weird shortage mentality, and
Yeah.
this was like the opposite end of the spectrum. There was a incredible amount of support, outpouring. People were loading up trucks. Like I said, the first guys that I saw that weren't in the neighborhood were from Illinois, and so once the pathways were a little bit more opened up, there was people coming through with, like, I had a guy from Georgia come by and give me uh, a bunch of like frozen meat that he had raised on his farm, and
Wow.
he was like, just in an act of goodwill, just people were traveling around and trying to help, and making sure that people had what they needed. So additionally, we had been able to slow down enough to actually connect with some of our neighbors in ways that we hadn't in a long time,
Right.
and share meals, or just kind of hang out and pull debris out of the road, and
Yeah.
get into this, get down under the bridge and throw rocks out to clear the waterway, and stuff like that. So yeah, these throwbacks to a different way and a different time slowed down in a different way, and not everybody was on the same schedule, and it was the kind of superimposition of a more natural timeline.
Right.
You know, you go to sleep a little earlier when you have to use candles to light to light your way. Um, it makes sense. The sun's going down. It's time to get ready for bed. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. And that's interesting when we talk about when your new journey in circadian rhythms and things like that.
Mhm.
I think you got a preview of maybe a reminder of how the world makes suggestions on how to live.
Right. Right.
That we often try to push those messages or those things away, but they're actually maybe helpful to follow instead.
Yeah, I mean, there's this, this overlaid grid of modernity that is we're all navigating through it in different, levels of saturation depending on our lifestyle and our location of where we live. But it's really something that is really hard to get away from. You have to really go against the grain and do things very intentionally in order to reconnect with a lot of these things. And so this was an opportunity for that to just be sort of removed from the equation.
Yeah.
And, I saw a lot of my neighbors were in a major shift from how they were living during the time before, and then during the storm when the power was out and the infrastructure was all down. And a couple of them told me like, oh, man, I don't really want it to go back to the way it was.
Right.
I'm enjoying something about this. And so, and I can relate to that. I could,
Yeah.
um, yeah.
And just because me and Brandy we do some food storage for earthquakes and other possible problems. Did did that turn out to be pretty useful? The food storage that you had done?
Yes, some of it. I mean, we didn't really tap into the deep reserves that much. Um, so I would say things like having freeze dried protein, like
Hmm.
meat, the good quality stuff that would be able to be like freeze dried and preserved.
Hmm.
Like if you don't have a way to run your chest freezer when the power's out,
Right.
because we had to strategically go through the stuff that we had frozen that we knew wasn't going to stay frozen. And so, there's a pretty short window of time unless you have additional measures in place, like, a generator that you've got with backup stuff to keep stuff frozen.
Yeah.
So I think the next step would be some other way of preserving those things. And yeah, I mean, we didn't have to go into the emergency storage stuff, really. We had enough canned and dried things. And then we were within the first, like, I'd say week and a half, we were able to start getting out to places where we could get some things.
Right. Right.
Um,
Eduardo, I'm dominating these questions on this, but I'm kind of
Well,
trying to stay in the area
yeah,
of
I
the
realize.
yeah. Okay. Do you want to maybe ask some of your questions as well?
Well, I mean, you have an apocalyptic view, you said, Jay.
mm,
Do you see some of the experience that you've went through as maybe foretelling for how you maybe would react or do things, or what things you would set in place for future events should we have disasters in the USA? And these are kind of things I have been wondering about as someone with a background in permaculture, and
mm,
I try to keep in mind what things and what systems and designs I can create for myself to sustainably live, uh, and not to depend on things. I saw what the hurricane did to friends of friends. Not, I don't know them directly, in Puerto Rico, and there was a permaculture community that were able to sustain themselves because they didn't rely on the grid, and they were off grid most, like maybe I'd say 80% of the time. So they didn't have to worry about a lot of things as most people did because they were so dependent on the government and so dependent on the
right,
resources.
right.
So is there something that you see from this experience that gave you that the 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 backup that you needed, and something that you've also reflected on to see what you need to do going into the future?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think having, since we're so reliant on, I mean, we're not in a place where we don't rely on electricity. So having some things in place, like having a generator. But the thing is with generators, I heard a lot of stories that a lot of people had generators, and if you're not using it regularly, a lot of people weren't able to get their generators started
Right.
during the
Yeah.
storm. And so, that kind of it's this interesting thing. Like, is permaculture and an agricultural based lifestyle. I mean, that's largely going to be how you are spending a lot of your time. It's going to be hard to do that as like you know a few hours a week kind of thing. So, it's an interesting balance there. I mean, I think that depending on where you are, because permaculture, you'd also have to have a piece of land, most likely, unless you have that integrated into some kind of an urban setup. And yeah, so I think that there's a certain element of maybe just like inner resourcefulness that we need to all be able to diversify, because not everybody's going to be able to be in a community of permaculture. Um, and in an urban situation, I mean, I think things I wouldn't really be equipped to know what to say to that, but I will say that my relationship with nature and the land has been a helpful thing through this process. Um, but I would say, having your water, a way to just make sure you can, if you're in a rural setting, having a way to just make sure you can filter your water. I mean, that's like the biggest thing right there. And then, food storage stuff. Yeah, there's a lot you can do with that. I mean, you could survive off of rice for a long time if you needed to. But water and a way to cook things. And then, ultimately, besides that, you gotta figure out like your laundry. That gets to be a thing. And then, the other thing that was interesting is there was no trash service for
Right.
that 3 weeks. And so we had the additional concern about bears. So we had to start, keeping our trash in closed doors and things like that. There was a lot of bears patrolling the neighborhood. But these are specific things to this region.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, water is kind of like the main thing. That was a lot of our time was spent collecting and filtering water or cooking water for various different applications and things like that. And it became a routine and an enjoyable process, and we were definitely more fortunate than a lot of people. Um, so yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question about that?
I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I think you reflect on the importance of the most important resources that you need so that you can survive into the future should another disaster happen. I constantly think about that, and I know not everyone here around me is very informed where I live about the importance of rainwater catchment systems or ponds or dams or swales or um, just the system of hydrology in the branch of permaculture. But these things I think are important for everyone to have as in any community and in urban spaces. I think more so because we're so reliant on the grid, and so
Right.
that's why I was wondering if there was any reflection on how you would do things differently.
Sure. And I mean, in a more densely populated environment, those things are going to become a lot more prominent or pronounced much quicker, because it's going to be uh there's going to be a lot more need and a lot less resources.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I was in Southern California in 2014 before my folks moved here. And I'd been living here for, maybe 6 or 7 years at that point, and had been exploring a lot of wilderness skills and primitive skills and earth skills type things, and getting to know the environment out here. And then I remember going out to Southern California, and it being, there being a drought, and looking around, and the level of affluence there was pretty high. And so just thinking about, well, what would happen here if the delivery truck stopped coming, and having it feel like a kind of a scary thought, versus what unfolded here in Appalachia, where there still remains a lot more people that know how to hunt, know how to fish, know how to live off the land, are comfortable being in wilderness. And so, I think that there was a large part of that enabled the general population to really rise to the occasion, so to speak.
Mhm. Eduardo, I want to see if you have other questions in this area, because I think the next place I want to go is a little bit farther back into like the response that we were hearing about, and some questions about that. But I want to see if you have other questions for Jay about just what they just went through and things like that.
I guess the only other thing besides trying to live sustainably or trying to not be so dependent on the grid is also, as you already brought up, Andy, the importance of community movement and the need to have what is the response. And I think over and over I keep seeing that in these natural disasters, I keep seeing uh, more people coming forward to help than maybe uh, selfishness as it's portrayed in apocalyptic films. Maybe that's just something I'm just
Mhm.
seeing, but I hope that is the world we live in, that the nobility, is it, or the generosity of the spirit of generosity comes forward when we are in those times. In 2017, Mexico City experienced uh, an earthquake here, and everyone supported each other. Everyone came out in support of each other. There was a lot of mutual aid, and so when you talk about people helping one another, I'd like to think that that is uh, the spirit of humankind, that we're still helping one another, not selfishly just taking care of our own, even though maybe sometimes the pressures of feeling like your whole world is collapsing might make you think, hold back on your resources. But it doesn't sound like that it happened in your case.
Yeah, I mean, it far surpassed any expectations I had about how people would act in a situation like that. It was much more heartwarming, and I felt really like touched by a lot of the things that I saw. And that's a good point. It's like how it is portrayed in these films or these shows or these stories is oftentimes not like that.
Yeah, yeah. I will say, listening, when I think about living in a more urban environment, in addition, we've tried to store water, because we do know that like water would be a hard thing if that could, like, when we think about it in terms of earthquakes, as probably the biggest thing that could hit this area,
Mhm.
and store some food. But I think in terms of the actual resource around us, it is probably a better relationship, or a better understanding of who our neighbors are, and just knowing each other's names. I think we know our adjacent neighbors, but then beyond that, not so much. I do feel like, as I think about me and Brandy moving, I think maybe the next time in our next neighborhood, maybe being able to reach out a bit more. That's what it feels like to me, as sort of a more immediate resource that you would build in run up to any sort of problems you might have in this kind of environment where it's not all trees and stuff like that.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because the preconceptions that I had about the South when I was younger were not really favorable to the culture.
Remind
For
us where
a lot
you're
of
originally from, though, James.
I was born in Philadelphia, and then I was raised in California.
Mm-hmm.
And so the stereotypes, ideas that I had about Southern culture wasn't really like a friendly one. And I would say time and time again, I mean, I've been here for 17 years now, so it's not like I'm a that new to the area. But I would say time and time again, I've been proven wrong. I have, for the most part, had a lot of really great experiences with people that have been around these parts for a long time.
Yeah.
I've got neighbors across the street that and over the mountain behind me that their family has been here since the 1700s.
Oh my gosh.
And so that's like a timeline that I never really thought about that growing up.
Mhm.
So yeah.
It's heartwarming when you say that, because I have this special connection to Idaho, because as an adolescent I did an exchange there, and rural Emmett, Idaho, which I had all these preconceptions of and all these preconceived ideas about, just happened to be all turned around from how I thought of it, from even just southern conservative states of Mexico to northern. It's the opposite in England. The northern area, the poorest, more peasant folk,
Mhm.
people that are more conservative, or even southern U.S. America. It just all these thoughts that other places seem to be more arrogantly above them, and
Right.
suddenly these notions or ideas about them are different from how we experience them when we're actually there. And so I think that's a true testament to
Mm.
my experience as well.
Yeah, it's amazing how many different things that we call stereotypes that seem a little bit more like lies. We just keep tripping over them. And I
Mhm.
wonder,
Mhm.
it's just so common. So it's a little
Yeah.
suspicious, to be honest, at one level. Um, so I'm from here. When I was hearing about what's going on in North Carolina, and yeah, it sounded awful. Like it sounded like, and I don't know. I know there are people who lost their lives and people who obviously lost homes and things like that. Some of the things that we were hearing about were the first controversies that I remember were like the government aid, FEMA, stopping people from going in and helping or not being helpful at all. I'm wondering if you have any way of speaking to that from an experience, yay or nay, or if you can say from on the ground, do you have a more of a sense of what was true about that? Was there was FEMA unhelpful, helpful? Were they actually stopping people from giving aid and doing all sorts of things? I remember hearing about helicopters, chasing people around who were trying to give aid. But you hear that, and But I don't know if you have any experience or heard stories or can speak to any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I didn't have any personal things confiscated from me, but I did talk to people that were saying that there were things being confiscated coming across borders, like diesel fuel, um, maybe some generators, things like that. Which, those were things that I had just heard from talking to different people. I had a friend who was down in this area from Michigan, and he was working with a uh, kind of like a veteran run search and rescue outfit. And I think they were they were based at this Harley Davidson dealer in Swannanoa, and they had a whole encampment. And so he was working with those guys, doing search and rescue and working with cadaver dogs. And he actually found a cadaver.
Hmm.
When it was in an area that had been signed off on by FEMA and the local police department. And so, I think that there was a lot of different channels of things going on. One thing that I would notice is that there'd be like these wellness check type of people coming through, and I would notice that there would be the same people being asked about by 12 different people over the course of 2 days. And so it seemed like they had a hard time organizing the efforts that were coming from outside, coming in trying to help. Like at some point, like a couple of weeks in, we were all saying no thank you to the cases of bottled water,
Right.
and then they were just being piled on the sides of the road. So
Mm.
like like there was this overreaction, like I said, to 2020, where it was like this scarcity mindset. This went so far in the other direction that after a certain point, it became a little bit disorganized. And, I mean, there was probably a lot of people that still were getting very much needed supplies that wouldn't have otherwise. But I think with some of these efforts coming in from outside, it was hard to make sense of what was going on. There's a lot of hollers. There's a lot of little like places to go and try and sort out and make sense. And, whether it's this outside organization or that outside organization, they're going to be driving up and down these roads and trying to make sense of what's what. Um, and, from a little bit more of like a grassroots kind of perspective, I think it was a little bit easier for people to make sense of what was needed. There was a little bit more of a personal connection, or even some of the groups that came from far away that were a little bit more grassroots. It was a little easier for them to maybe take the time to talk and understand, and it didn't feel so much like the differential of exchange didn't feel so pronounced.
Hmm.
So I think that there was some of that going on. And then I did hear a lot about, contentious things happening between FEMA and some areas. It wasn't so much immediate to this area here, but I did hear about a lot of that. And I mean, I did hear a lot of things from a lot of people about finding bodies, and that was like this thing where it was really hard to get a clear story about that. I remember at some point not that long ago, like well after the storm, I just did a Google search for what was the death toll in Swannanoa, and it came up 0. More recently I did one that said like 42. But, the first day that I got out, JD and I got out and we went in to make some phone calls. We stopped at the post office because it had been probably like 5 days and we had been expecting a couple of things. We wanted to see if we could try and track them down. And I went in there and there was one other lady in the post office, and she told me that out of her 20 some houses in her neighborhood, there was only 4 left.
Mm.
They all washed into the river, and that she watched her neighbor get swept away in the river. And so there was this really kind of layered experience that was going on because, then another mile out down the road, we pulled over at a friend's shop where we knew we could just park for a minute and get on the phone. And the power was out, but there were people out walking their dogs, so it was relatively minor, not far from where we were. But then if you went a couple miles in the other direction, the once 20-foot wide river had become 150 feet wide and 40 feet deep, and washed away a huge amount of stuff in its wake.
Yeah.
And that's sort of one of the things of the topography of this area out here. It's like the way that the mountains and the hollers and the different little areas come together, it can be radically affected in one area, and then on the other side of the mountain, nothing. So it did really lend itself to a little bit of this disparity as far as what the different experiences were, what the stories were. You could spin that stuff. So, if you're in a position where you're, wanting to make things look a little bit more catastrophic, you could. And if you're in a position where you're wanting to downplay that or something, then you could also do that. And so that's kind of one of the things that I was seeing in real time as this was going on. It was like, that's not matching up with this, and this isn't matching up with that. And then I can imagine from the outside, it must have been hard to make sense of what's going on.
Well, and here's what I'd be curious if you, because for me, this happened in the backdrop of Lahaina in Hawaii,
Yeah.
and and the whole notion of, in that case, again, this is the story from the outside. It just seems like the government effort is not about helping anybody. It's just about control, and and it might even be even more pernicious than that. And that's how it was talked about in Lahaina. And I think there was a similar narrative starting to develop, that FEMA was there just to actually stop aid from getting there. And again, and there's another backdrop that starts to occur about like land grabs and
Right.
lithium mines and quartz mines. I, I actually can't speak to that stuff. I'm prone to believing it because that's just, I have a very skeptical thing, but there's a difference between being skeptical and saying, oh yeah, I can believe that, and talking to you right now and saying, after this experience, does it give you more of a sense of, yeah, these state actors did seem like it was a more pernicious thing, or in some ways, is it more like, well, no, it's just a confusing thing? And I'm curious if you have a take based on your own experience, because that I really wanted to hear. If it doesn't mean you're the last word on it, but based on having gone through it, do you have a feeling about the way these state institutions that say they're trying to help, are they trying to help? Did they help? I don't know. Does it make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah. It's really hard to parse that stuff out. I mean, I I can entertain some of these ideas about, the lithium mining and the land grabs and things like that. I mean, I know there is two companies that were nearby that are either have established lithium mines or are in the process. And, one of them received, I think, somewhere in the ballpark of like $250 million in grants from the Department of Energy and from the Department of Defense in 2022 and 2023. So, you look at stuff like that and you're like, okay, so the timeline
Yeah.
of, was that happening in preparation for something to then lay the ground for this thing to happen? And, I don't know how much of that we're going to be able to get to the bottom of. The other thing with Lahaina, and what I heard a lot of talk around here, was like this directed energy idea, like a
Yeah.
directed energy weapon.
Yeah.
And so, there was a lot of talk about that in Lahaina. There was a lot of talk here about that. And I alluded to something with the fact that I slept through this thing and that my 7-year-old also slept through this thing. The other thing that I think is of note is that, so we had this rain event, and then we had the hurricane event, and then for the almost the entirety of the following 3 weeks, not a drop of rain.
Mm,
And so it created this really interesting situation where we had a lot of flooding and riverbanks and sediment and debris over up into the street, and then everything just baking and dry, and then a lot of extra vehicles and people, and so it created this like really dusty, like we made it into Swannanoa at one point, and we were going to talk to our friend that was working with the rescue crew, and we drove through Swannanoa, and it was, around sunset, and the dust was everywhere, and the sunset was really red looking because of all the dust, and there was debris piled on the sides of all the streets, and there was people in every parking lot. I mean, and it looked like unrecognizable that we were even in this country. It was really something else. And so, yeah, I mean, it's hard to really parse some of these things out. But I mean, I do, like, if you guys want to hear, I have an interesting story about like this kind of esoteric, like metaphysical perspective on both Lahaina and what happened in Appalachia. So, should I just launch into that? Okay.
that's why you're
So,
invited to talk, man.
sure. So, man, I would say probably sometime around the early 2000s. And I've been a conspiracy enthusiast for, since I was in my teens. And so I love a lot of these stories, a lot of these alternative historical ideas, a lot of things that really question the way that we're used to looking at certain things.
Mhm.
So there's a guy named Michael Tessarian, and I believe he's like Irish, but he was also like he's an occultist, and he would incorporate elements of Vedic and old Celtic astrology into an interesting mix of like origin stories around humanity and its origins as far as being, genetically manipulated by, you know, old alien races. And I mean, this isn't necessarily something that I'm like basing my day-to-day life on, but I love these stories because they're really interesting. So he tells this story. There's this race of serpentine beings that were fleeing somewhere where they were scoundrels, and they were kicked out of where they were going. So they came to Earth and they hid out on Earth. And they ended up taking the indigenous life forms that were like primates of some sort, and blending it with their DNA and making another form of life. And then that second race ended up rebelling against the first race. So then they made another race that had the higher intelligences disconnected, and that was the human race. So here we are, and then the first race that was created goes and sets up sets up their base in Lemuria. The original creator race sets up their base in Atlantis, and he places Atlantis in Appalachia, and he places Lemuria in the South Pacific, or in the Polynesian area. And so there was this battle that ensued, and this whole thing. And so some of those old tales that go back to like the Vedic texts, they talk about these weird airships and laser beams, and some of these ideas that certain areas in desert arid climates are residual from these intense energy disputes and weapons and things like that. But it's interesting because there was this like thread that I thought of that connected these two places together, the Lemurian Hawaiian Islands Pacific area and the Atlantean Appalachian area. And then they both involve these like directed energy kind of ideas. And it's just these themes and these motifs that's from so long ago.
Right.
Even when I heard that story in my life was 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing. And then I was also looking at this idea of what happens, like, okay, so you look at weather modification, and there's stuff going back to like the 40s. I think there was something called Project Cirrus, and they were basically using dry ice to try and cloud seed. And there was another instance of a storm that was being seeded with something, and it ended up coming aground in Savannah, Georgia, also in the 40s. And I think it was one of the story was that they were trying to like dispel the potency of the storm, and they maybe ended up making it stronger, and then it caused this damage. And at least that's like some of these official stories. But you think about these types of things, and these are what's acknowledged as truth by the mainstream back in the 40s. And you got to imagine that in the past, the 80 years since then, things have come a long way. And so like, I don't know how we would ever really truly get to the bottom of some of this stuff, but it does seem like there's more at play here than we're being told or really able to understand. And so what do we do? What do we do with that?
Right. And you can kind of confirm that there are these lithium mines have been established, are starting. Do you see that them being established was in any ways facilitated by this event?
I haven't been tracking it. I mean, I've heard things like lithium is the new oil.
It is. I mean, I can say for a fact that like that's the one thing for the U.S. war machine, particularly as they think about not just missiles but drones and things like that. All these smart weapons, you just need lithium, cadmium, all these rare earth things that China has more of a hold on globally than the United States. So there's definitely a need for their, in terms of what they think is needed.
Sure.
So there would be an interest for that. And there's things happening right now that the U.S. is involved in that speak to the need to, develop those mines and Eduardo and I interviewed somebody who was fighting lithium mining. Where was it, Eduardo? It's on the west. Do you remember?
Uh,
It was near
oh,
Nevada or something like that. But
yeah,
yeah, but that, it's just, that is the future. The one of the things that are going to be important, like oil, is not just data, but these rare earth minerals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting that, and also there were the stories of what was this event, a weather modification event, using like HARP technologies and things like that. The
Right. And it's
harmonic
interesting,
resonances
like,
into the sky.
yeah, and so like I was looking into that a little bit, and so there's like, the ionosphere, and then there's like where we are, I think they call it the troposphere,
Mm.
and then in between that is the stratosphere. And so like when you get these really intense storm systems, that has a pretty pronounced effect on like the ionic charge within the environment. And so, yeah, I mean, there was something that happened in the aftermath of that, where the weather felt odd, but time and the whole, I mean, obviously the circumstances would lend itself to that, but
Yeah,
I do feel like there was something else palpable in the aftermath.
yeah,
Um, and I mean, it's ions and electricity, and that all like plays into our serotonin, and so there's so much there. Um, there was just layers. So
yeah. Questions from you, Eduardo?
no, I'm where there's a lot of speculation, and normally people would say, well, these things are a lot of conspiracies, but I think just to remind folks how much the government has covered up, that it is not our fault to be constantly wondering what the hell is happening when you have the government constantly covering things up. So, um, time will tell, as with everything, I think. And if not, then there's always people that still hold on to a lot of evidence afterwards, and they still try to dispel the narrative that the government is sharing. Anyhow, no, I'm good.
Yeah, and I I don't know how far. I mean, I'm very suspicious of the institutions and stuff like this, and almost there was things I would have called prior to COVID. There are things I would have said, "Oh, that's not. They didn't do that. Or they
uh-huh.
wouldn't do that." I mean, I'm pretty much done with that. I don't. I kind of would say I don't know how. I'm willing to believe that they will and can do kind of anything. So even the story you're talking about with that tale you say about the original people, the lizard people, plus the two different life forms that came out of that. I mean, I think those are interesting stories, but also I don't dismiss those things out of hand as in the way I used to, because
Sure.
I've been proven wrong too many times by kind of hardening my mind and saying, "Oh, that's not
Hmm.
possible." And I'm
Yeah,
kind of
we get into like quantum biology has been a huge um, theme in our lives as of late, and we talked a little bit about this idea of like the circadian rhythms and getting back to closer rhythms and patterns and cycles that more closely resemble nature, and the light and the dark and things like that. But if you think about the spectrum of light that we can detect with our eyes, it's a very narrow amount. So
yeah,
what we're even able to like visually see is just a fraction of what's really there. And
yeah,
you can extrapolate that out into all of these other areas of our lives.
yeah, yeah.
And you know, we were recently on our podcast, JD was writing and doing some things around this idea of the Maha, which the Kennedy and the Maha thing and all the stuff that came up around that. And so then I started like kind of looking at this from a little bit of more of an alchemical lens and thinking about, okay, so Maha was actually like extracted from Maga, right? It was sort of this like almost feminine quality of this thing extracted from this like, polarized like male principle of Maga, And it was this interesting thing that happened on this like meta level, but then there was this uh I guess this open letter that was written to Maha and around Maha from some people towards Kennedy and those people, and saying like, do these things or we're going to find people to replace you. And then I started thinking like, okay, so that's sort of then coming back down to this other level of like trying to play the game from within the board, rather than doing something like an alchemical extraction
Mm.
and making those types of, do this or that, or we're going to do this, making those types of threats is not really going to have much of an impact on people that can pull off something like 9/11, or COVID,
Mhm.
or if Helene is an orchestrated event that could pull off something of that magnitude. I don't think that's the approach that's going to really affect the type of change that we would want to see.
Mm.
And so, what that indicates to me is that there's like a personal responsibility to take stock and do some, you know, alchemical bookkeeping within our own beings so that we can be more clear in how we approach these things. Because, I mean, we can talk about all this conspiratorial stuff, and there's no way to prove or disprove really on a grand scale, like how these things, yes, 50 years from now, the documents may come out that prove it, and everybody's pretty much moved on to the next thing.
Right.
But what we can do is we can explore within these types of conversations and within our own relationships ways that we can then clarify and hone our own perception. And then, yeah, I mean, it feels like that's a important piece of all of this.
Yeah, and I do want to get to the question about the school, but I do think the themes here, as opposed to knowing what the government's going to do or who did this, the themes were being more familiar with your environment and nature around you, and being more familiar with your neighbors are like the things that are going to get us through these things.
Hmm. For sure.
I'm not saying don't know about conspiracies, but we have to put error bars on those things, and I don't know how much they help us navigate these moments.
Right. It's definitely a fine line. Did you ever see the film Don Peyote?
Mm-mm.
It's a story about a guy that kind of goes down a conspiratorial rabbit hole. It's pretty well done, and but it illustrates how consuming these things can be. And at the end of the day, really, I think the quality and integrity of your being and your character, and then by extension your relationships, is going to have much more of an impact than how much conspiratorial knowledge you have amassed.
Yeah,
Like what you were saying, so it's
yeah. I mean, I think it's good to be skeptical and know and be and know that maybe when the hand comes, I believe when the helping hand of the state comes in, you better watch out. You better watch. As
Mhm.
opposed to the helping hand of your neighbor. I don't. I think that is one where I think we are often encouraged to be more skeptical of that. And I think our skepticism of each other has to get lower. And I do believe skepticism towards the state, corporations, institutions. I don't think you get hurt by being a little wary of that stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and then this gets back to it. Maybe what Eduardo now is the question about what you were saying about the school.
Well, yeah, I mean, this brings up several things for me. So number one, so tell us, Jay, about the aftermath of the hurricane, and in relationship with the academy that you all built. Because when we did an episode last time with you all, well, there were two episodes, but the episode on Ada, I think that is the most important one that I'd like to know, since I've visited your site since, and I've seen the sad closure of it, for two factors, and one of them being the hurricane. Can you share with us?
Sure. Yeah. So, um, we had established ADA largely in reaction to a lot of the lockdowns and the digital online schooling. And, we had 5 kids in school at that time, and they were all doing virtual stuff. And then that didn't really work very well for our family. Um, it was really kind of just detrimental to a lot of the well-being of the kids. And then as we started to get a little bit more into it, we realized that, well, we had this opportunity to create this environment, and it was based on having in-person, uh, you know, education. And then additionally, it was informed by basically nature, immersed in nature and in person. And then there was a number of other factors that we were really clear on wanting to hold a boundary around. So a big one at the time was the shot, the COVID shot, and another big one was the masks, and another some of the other aspects that went along with that, such as like the health screening and
Mhm.
or the contact tracing, those
Right.
types of things. So we really worked to set up an environment where things could happen without a lot of that, without any of that stuff going on. And then over time, like pretty quickly, we there was a lot of hot energy coming in, and a lot of things, once things sort of settled and got into a groove, it became really apparent to us that rather than us, fighting against something, we really were ultimately better our time would be better spent investing in creating what we thought
Yep.
should be there, and really ultimately what resonated with our ideas of what schooling and education should have been all along. These were things that that was the context for ATA and its formation. And then I think, we ran for about 4 years, and it was a wild ride. It was a lot of ebb and flow and up and down, and um, it ended up being really um, energy intensive for both JD and I. And then in about a month before the storm happened, she had a melanoma diagnosis, and so we were trying to sort that out and figure out what that meant for our lives, and how and if we were going to be able to continue doing things with ATA. And so we had pretty much resolved within ourselves that we were going to push forward. And then, the storm happened, and so much of the land was just in a state of chaos and disarray, and the road was gone, and it felt like it was uh, the right decision for us to then shift and focus on her health and our family. And then I think the other piece was also trying to take some of the lessons and the experiences that we'd had in the 4 years of ATA and translate that into something that could be shared on a little bit of a broader platform. 'Cause I would always tell people at these, um, events that we would go to and speak at, that we wanted to promote and help people set up things like ATA in other places, because no matter how much success we had or how much vibrance we had in our program, we could really only cater to probably about 50 families,
Mhm.
and there's a much broader need throughout the country, throughout the world. So the idea of turning that into a forum where we can then share some of these experiences and the lessons and the tools that we've learned through this process, so going into the podcast. And so that seemed like a way to translate some of that into something that could be shared with a greater audience. So that's and then what was the
I guess, do you have any follow-up question, Andy?
No, I want you to continue with your questions. I think they're good ones, and I'll stop today.
I people should check out that episode, on a separate a future episode, you should come back, Jay. I'd like to explore more collective community approaches to the way that we nurture our children, because I have a background in education and I've worked in primary schools in the USA, and I've worked with kids just of all ages throughout my life, from volunteering through even fostering a child myself. And so I think we should get you back on to have a discussion on approaches, because I'd like to know what the reflections on that, because we were when we had that episode with you, we were discussing just your development of that academy,
Right.
the
Right.
aftermath after so many years. I think we need to revisit that conversation.
Okay.
So I'd like to do that with you. And so before I move on to the other two items that I had thought about, you now out of this though also created this project with this podcast. Can you share a bit more about that? And because I was looking through your site, and it's not just about your reflections on ADA. It's also, as you also talked about, quantum biology.
Right. So yeah, quantum biology has been and it's been a really great focal point or focal, lens for us to bring a lot of these principles and concepts together into and how we live and how we raise our kids and how we educate. So many of the themes that were present in how we did things with ATA are really, work so well with this principle of quantum biology and really just following the template of nature. I think that that's such a big piece of that. So with the podcast, it was we focused on homeschooling because we had been coming out of this past 4 years of our lives as being so enmeshed in that world. Um, Quantum biology, because that's been a major revelatory introduction into both mine and JD's lives and how we want to continue to move forward with our children and our lifestyle, and then really understand or being inspired by um, how these principles can be implemented in order to sync us up with something that can allow for a greater sense of connectivity with something beyond ourselves. And so there's a piece of it too where it links into our connection with God and spirit. And so you have like quantum biology, the guiding principle is light. I mean, Jack Kruse says it's light, water, and magnetism. And so there's a avenue, and I was sharing a lot of my personal views with the student body through ATA in the natural setting, getting out into the woods and taking off your shoes and doing movement and breath in conjunction with the time of day or the season. And so those are all quantum biological principles.
Hmm.
And so there's this way that these things have you know circled back around to make sense. And then the other piece has to do with family and what we've run into, what we're struggling with, what we're aiming for, what we see as possible ways to continue to uphold the sanctity of not only childhood but like family. And yeah, so those are the themes that we're going to be discussing. And JD has a really rich background in midwifery and home birth midwifery, and she has a real aptitude for understanding the human organism and in a different way than I do. And then I have this sort of metaphysical or mystical kind of uh, leaning that really lights me up. And so bringing these things together in a way where we can connect with other people and share some of the things that we're excited about. And then like we recently did an interview with we did our first interview like a couple weeks ago. And so we interviewed a guy named Josh McLaughlin, and he was living in the area, and he actually did some work with some of our kids as a counselor. He was in the mental health and psychology, and has degrees in divinity and psychology. So he's this really interesting intersection of these things. And so we did an interview with him, and so exploring a lot about this aspect of faith and spirituality, and where that lands in each of us, and how that interplays with family, how that interplays with nature, how that interplays with quantum biology, and how that interplays with education. And yeah, so it's we're excited. We're just getting started, but like we're excited to have a lot of these conversations and explore.
Yeah, and I do hope I would like to do another episode where we talk about the Freedom Rising podcast, because there's a lot of stuff you went into in those first 4 episodes of your first journey that I think would
Mhm.
be really, if you'd be willing to share some of those, and hopefully JD could be here. Um, so definitely, I'm hoping this is just a teaser for
Sure.
for later stuff.
That
Um,
conversation would definitely best suited to include JD for
yeah,
sure.
I would like that. And like I said, I'm hoping Brandy can join us as well, because I thought a lot of, like I told you, a lot of the things that I saw that your experiences you're having, they resonated with the kind of journeys that Brandy and I have gone on as well. So
Mm,
um, either parallel or close to, kind of thing. So I wanted her here as well for that, if possible, if possible.
great.
Um, I will maybe do a few return questions to your school. First off, what was the response of the families that had been part of that school when they heard that that school would not go on any longer? Was that a difficult thing, or how did people respond to that?
I mean, it was a bit of a mixed review. There was a mixed response. I mean, I think a lot of people's lives were also thrown into such disarray through the process, because we really, most people were in a pretty close proximity, like living in a pretty close proximity. There was one uh, parent that I was leaving. I think this was like 2 weeks after the storm. I was leaving. At that point, we had a workable road, so maybe it was like two plus weeks, and I see him driving out the road to come out to the land, and he said he had just driven on pavement for the first time that day.
Hmm.
He'd been up in the where he was living, and it took him that long to cut his way out so he could drive out of there. And so there was some sadness, there was some understanding, and I think that it's for the kids, was probably some of the kids probably had uh, some mourning in a way. I know our 7-year-old has on many occasions shared that he really misses that environment.
Yeah,
And I think about the that kind of breaks my heart.
yeah,
And I also there's a part of it, it's bittersweet. I mean, I think about, wow, these some of these kids that got to experience this, sort of a rare thing to be able to experience. There was some magic that happened. It wasn't every day, but there was some pockets of magic that I think about. Some of these kids when they're like teenagers, thinking back on the stuff that we were doing, because like I said I did qigong with these kids almost every day. And one day at the end of our session, we would do this thing where we would, rub our hands together, feel the energy, create it into a ball, and then we would, toss it back and forth. Say somebody's name and throw them the ball. And then I'm just kind of improvising, and one day we brought it all in together into one ball, and I was like, okay, now we're going to throw it up in the air, and we're going to hit that cloud. And so we do. We throw it up and we hit a cloud, and then we're like, well, let's just watch and see what happens to this cloud. And so over the next like 15 minutes, the cloud actually dissipated. And so we're like, okay, we should try this again. So then we started doing a, you know, by week, like every couple days, we do the practice of, trying to cloud bust with our electromagnetic energy in our minds. And then one day, one kid's like, "Hey, there's a chemtrail. Let's try and bust that." And so, and just getting this different way of relating to each other in the world, and that we can have this interesting intersection of imagination and spirit and creativity and science and whatever you want to call it, is this interesting field of possibility. And so, yeah, I was thinking about some of these kids later when they're like, "Oh yeah, when I was in fourth grade or whatever, this is one of the things that we did."
That's right. It was our earliest experiments in weather modification.
So it made me chuckle.
That's crazy.
But yeah, it was a hard decision to make, and I think that a lot of people were, although they were understanding, it was sad.
Yeah.
And but at the same time, like we had to kind of make that call circumstantially. The land was just really unpredictable, and there's still like with that much stuff getting shaken up, the waterways have shifted a little bit. There's still some unpredictability as far as, like, I just yesterday, JD and the kids were coming back from a walk, and then a few minutes after they passed this part of the road, a tree fell.
Wow.
And that's still happening on a weekly basis. And so there's some instability that has been introduced into the land just in general that wasn't there before. And so that was a really it was a deciding factor as well, just having all these kids out here all the time, and how still unstable things are feeling.
Yeah.
So
And your memories, like your thoughts now or feelings as you think back on what you and JD did over those 4 years. Um, Imagine you're pretty proud of what you had done, and also there must kind of some sadness of seeing it come to an end.
absolutely. And I think the other piece that I will say, that I'll speak to, is that from the point in 2020 when we sort of when this like movement kind of coalesced around us and this property here, there was a momentum that had gained some speed. And there were some ebbs and flows with that momentum over time, but I would say that over those 4 years, there was a lot of white knuckling going on. And it seems like there was still a reactivity that we collectively as a group of families, and whatever you want to say, health freedom conspiratorialists,
Yeah.
whatever the group is, there was a reactivity that was still very much ungrounded through a lot of that process. And so I think that from a community based perspective, like, we've all got a lot to learn still.
Yeah.
um I am incredibly grateful for the experience. And there's also a piece of it where it's like, when you're in something, you don't always realize the intensity and the toll that it has until you stop.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't change it for anything. And there was, like, once again, layers to this.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think one of the themes that's been coming up politically on what's left has been kind of reform or revolution, and what kind of world do we want? The thing you said of, look, of course, there's some things we do have to like resist and fight sometimes, but the idea of moving that focus more towards, well, what do you maybe put your energy more into how you actually want things to be. I personally believe that is one of the keys that people who the if humanity is going to fight for change, it's going to have to be to about what kind of change are we trying to build versus what kind of thing are we trying to take down. I do think there's going to take a taking down is going to probably need to happen, but
Mhm.
I actually believe you don't take something down unless you have something to replace it with. And so I do
Right.
think that idea that you talked about in terms of the school, I feel like is fundamental to the possibility of bigger change ever happening. Is more of us are going to have to really grasp that, grapple with that, learn to try to do with the community. And like you said, you're going to have a lot of white knuckling while you do it, and a lot of things you don't know how to do. You're going to have to learn how to do it together in a new way because we haven't been taught to do that. So the project, I think my biggest critique sometimes of the left and activists, and I'm saying myself, is we put a lot of energy into resisting something, not much into what is it that we want to build. And I do think that's going to have to change.
Yeah. It's it's definitely like a bit of a slippery slope, with like the fighting.
Hmm.
We were in downtown Asheville, and I had I got dropped off to go pick something up, and JD and Jaro Jaro's our 7-year-old. They were down right in the middle of town, and there was a some kind of protest going on. I think it was like the No Kings protest,
Hmm.
and Jaro was frightened by the energy of it. It was a lot of screaming and a lot of and I didn't really get as much of a dose of it, but I had this experience of, first of all, not being able to understand what it was um, when I came upon it. There was a lot of flags, and it was like, is this like a promoting the flag or not promoting the flag? I didn't understand, but just
Hmm.
visually. But then I had this sense of, didn't seem like, I mean, the protest thing gets really riled up and this and that, but it seemed like there would be very little chance of being able to have a conversation with most of those people. And that was my impression just up on passing by. But yeah, my 7-year-old he was like scared of the energy of it.
Hmm.
And so, that does sort of speak to like this, we all have a creative spark within us. And so, how are we going to wield that? Are we going to wield it as um, a weapon or a agent of building or creativity? And that's for each of us to try and figure that out. And no, we're not going to all know how to do it right away. We're not going to be perfect at it. And then when you start to add in these elements of trying to do it with, you know, your partner, let alone a group of people, and then it gets dicey sometimes.
Hmm.
And then there's a lot of amazing things that can come out of it, but it's still a very unpredictable and unknown thing that we're all trying to
Right.
figure out and navigate.
And yet something in that disaster that took place, there's a way that a certain type of creative energy kind of coalesced almost effortlessly in a way. So I think it's going to be hard. I also think there are going to be elements that are going to be almost more natural than we might suspect in the process.
Right. Yeah, and I mean that situation is an interesting one because it feels like, with a natural disaster, or from in if you go into like the whole world of insurance and things like that, they call it an act of God.
Yeah.
And so they're within that, embedded within that, and the people that are experiencing that, it makes me think that there's not a direct line to like, this guy's to blame or this government is to blame or things like that. That came later with like the different theories and things like that, and that unfolded over time. But at the ground level, it was hey, we're all experiencing this anomalous and unexplainable event, and
Hmm.
we're in this together. And so that actually allowed for this really another level of camaraderie to take place.
Yeah. Yeah. I was very curious, and I think that I'm glad you guys made it through. But I really appreciate you sharing some of this stuff because I think there's lots of lessons to learn about it, about the possibility of bigger change.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the No Kings protest segues into the other questions I have, which is, well, first I just wanted to say in preparation for this episode, I realized you had I learned afterwards that you have a podcast. So I look forward to listening to everything that you're sharing, even the interview you talked about, because I teach yoga here. I'm a yoga instructor, and I don't believe in God, but I talk a lot about the ecology, bird migration. I talk about the lunar phases. I talk about things that I think are always have an influence on our state of being. So I think I'll look forward to listening to your podcast.
Yeah.
And I'd like to also, as Andy, we keep having episode ideas. I think another time we'll have another episode with you about those things as well. The other part, I guess, my third area that I wanted to enter was, we connected because of 2020, because we were trying to find community in a world that was being overcome with the health scare and manipulating people into thinking that we all need to follow and sheep-like and be just one, right, with the government. We just have to align and trust the government. That's how it should be.
Right.
And out of that, I also came out of a left that I thought that I knew, that took in consideration my thoughts and opinions because I was a person of color and whatever, and all the liberal woke left made me feel like I had a voice in their world, except when I came out against their agenda, then suddenly my voice didn't matter. So that was an S of politics. And I have since left that liberal left wing of just the conventional mainstream left of the USA. And then we found you and other people that were also like-minded. And what I loved about this new community is how much we were trying to beat against big government and Big Brother. And now it's AI and tech and surveillance and privacy concerns and just the massive data collection that is happening in our state and our world affairs currently. And as I'm trying to come up with my question for you, and you live in North Carolina, I also have a friend who is a Trump supporter who we created a podcast called Bantercast Live, in which I've since been kicked out because we've debated too much. And he's a Trump supporter. I still love him. 20 years of friendship, marriage, still going strong. Jay, the largest AI center hubs that are developing strong tech centers and AI is at the border, and Homeland Security is developing. I'm keeping track of these. Electronic Frontier Foundation, Red R3D, a Mexican website that's also keeping track of the surveillance that's happening at the border, and the smart city that we have here in Mexico at Ciudad Juarez, where an ex-Air Force, I don't know, part of the military, in 2015 created this operation in Ciudad Juarez and then tried to create it in Ohio, which didn't go well, in Dayton, Ohio. And there was a podcast that I listened to called Radio Lab, where they had an episode dedicated to this. And I shared this with Workers and Students for Choice. And I shared this, and now I'm seeing how this smart city in Ciudad Juarez, the amount of tech that they're able to follow every individual life because of so many cameras. It is a Orwellian dystopian city. It's a smart city in my country. And it's developing. All this AI is being developed at the border, and I'm keeping track of all of this happening. And I'm wondering, now that Trump's in office, and I don't have anything specifically against Trump, I have everything against Biden and Trump and anybody, any Democrat, Republican at the White House. What is the sentiment in North Carolina regarding immigration, because I think what's happening with, and I made a prediction in one of the episodes on What's Left, that immigration is the new boogie person currently, as we've seen with 9/11, with the weapons of mass destruction, as we've seen with the war on drugs, as we've seen with COVID, as we've seen with the war on terror. It's like all this smokescreen, or all this wait for us to manipulate the masses to have a larger agenda be put forth, such as Palantir, getting all the platforms, the US American platforms, all into one system. And that's what Doge has recently just done, creating every single platform, every federal agency finally connected to be able to track and monitor the US American public. And immigration is the new boogie person put right in front of us, that is the way that we have to do things, because we have to get rid of these criminals, which I've seen reports and reports of all the people that are being deported, and the 90% of those people that are being deported are not actually criminals, and they're being used as bait, everyone to scare the American public that we have to do this in order to get rid of these criminals, right? But in the background of all of this, Palantir, military operations, and AI is being developed. And I thought maybe the freedom movement would be open to this. And conversations I'm having, such as with my best friend, my childhood best friend, Jake, are so blind to it because he voted for Trump. And this is his idea. Like we had a criticism on Andy and I on the No Kings protest, by the way, and we weren't a part of it. But I do have this resistance towards big government, and I'd like to know your point of view with the context that I gave you and the sentiment in North Carolina with everything that I just mentioned.
Yeah.
There you go.
I mean, it's an interesting, I really have, like, in the area of my life around politics, like, I would consider myself apolitical. In 2020, I found myself involved with a number of different health freedom groups because JD and I realized that there was something fishy going on. We didn't want to do the masks and the health screening. So I found myself in these environments with an interesting combination of new age hippie Asheville people and like good old Southern boys, like toting guns and driving pickup trucks. And we're all in the same room together. And a lot of these movements were in and around Trump and supporting Trump. And so they would be bringing things like, how to use ham radios, how to like do things to actually like circumvent being reliant on like the big system. But when the conversations would turn to me with like, well, hey, what do you think about Trump? Trump's going to save the world and this and that. And I'm like, well, honestly, like, I don't believe in that at all. But I can talk about all this conspiratorial stuff with you. And like, there's this interesting overlay. And so, AI is a really interesting thing that's going on because it's like, under one perspective, there's like some sort of a singularity, transhumanist singularity movement that's like supposed to be what we're headed towards. And there does seem to be this momentum that's building, like you were talking about, with how much data collection, like at what point is that gonna like either backfire or like, because data isn't really necessarily tangible. So at what point is it going to be compressed into something that's like tangible? And is that like when AI becomes sentient? I don't know. There's this building layer of something going on, and there's an eerie quality to it at times. Within within the Gnostic kind of historical religious view of like early Christianity, there's a version of that where there was something that was created outside of the natural order, and it's called a demiurge. And the demiurge is what's responsible for creating the world that we live in. And it's essentially the demiurge is not aware of its own origins. And so it's what is explained as like what a lot of the world religions think of as God, but it's actually like a step away from that. And so you can sort of liken what's going on with technology. There's this parallel going on where there's like, and there's actually a really interesting guy that I just found out about named Tom Montauk, and he talks a lot about this like demiurgic technology. And so, yeah, I mean, there's within that, there's this idea of simulation type situation that we may find ourselves in. I don't know if either of you have heard about like this idea of like simulation theory. And
Mhm.
it's like this idea that we're living in almost like the Matrix in the movie, you know, that's actually what's going on. And so with AI, with the political landscape, with these things like, you know, and I'm admittedly like a little bit ignorant around what the larger context is around immigration in this state. Um, you know, I recently traveled to El Salvador and asked a lot of people a lot of questions about, you know, where things were at, what their take was on things. And but you know, I'm so far removed from politics most of the time that it became more of like an interpersonal exchange and just curiosity. Like I don't feel like I have a meta picture around what you're talking about with immigration. Um,
Well, even if you have your, maybe since you live there, even if you just can share with us maybe what your neighbors or your community, if you have a pulse on what's happening with their idea about immigration, because I have had conversations with people who I thought we were on the same page regarding big government and the regular scares that are put in front of us. And I think I don't know where we've lost each other. You know, this is not because I'm trying to, you know, at one point maybe I had these humanitarian reasons why we should support. It's like, you know, immigration, but it's beyond humanitarian reasons for me. It's like way beyond, you know, families just the need to, it's to me, it's what's happening. I mentioned these three areas, you know, it's like the Electronic Frontier Foundation that's tracking that what's happening at the border, and Red R3D, which is a website, a Mexican website that's tracking everything that's happening at the border. And even if people are, and that's fine, like if you don't know the extensive overreach that's happening, I try to inform the public, and I just, the minute I talk about the privacy concerns, the surveillance, the tracking of our lives, I think that that's an area that we can all just agree on. I don't have any interest in converting or having conversations where I'm trying to convince people why immigration is good for the economy or anything or humanitarians. I don't care about that anymore. To me, it's the whole planet is now being tracked through systems that are going to be shared by national governments. And we are seeing the effects of that currently today with Palantir, for example. And I'm afraid of that. I'm afraid of the hippie movement being ignored, where we talked about once we called it off grid. The 60s were about being off grid. And we're now promoting and advocating for the capture of immigrants. But by doing that, we are now also allowing for systems like these to happen because
right. I
there
mean,
are larger forces at play here. And I'm thinking, where are you all, freedom people? What's happening? You know, do we not know that by supporting this, we're developing more AI centers, more data collection? All platforms are going to be intrinsically connected. Like we have Alison McDowell talking about this, and other people that are on the subculture of this, and we should be actually illegal. Most of it, I keep saying that on WhatsApp, we should actually be illegal and promoting that because that's what we called for in the 60s at one point, being off grid.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
it's to what, like, it's like reaching such a crescendo, it seems, though. It's like I I don't know what to make of this technological, like, upsurge, you know? It's
yeah,
like I don't really, I mean, other than having control of, well, I think about the reference points that I have are like, are you guys familiar with the book, um, Behold a Pale Horse? There's
I
a
think so.
guy named William Cooper, and apparently he was a military guy and found a document in like an old copier that basically had a schematic that was like a diagram of an electrical like circuitry type thing, but it was like basically how to control the population with currency. But at the time, he was talking about money and currency, but it was like making an analogy to an electrical grid of how to control, and so from this kind of like, I guess, mystical or esoteric standpoint, it's like it's a kind of like energy farm mentality around like how to harness and control the flow of like population. So it's like there is a complete like dehumanization aspect to a lot of the things that it sounds like you're describing, and it's like, are we being asked to basically relinquish our humanity and you know basically plug in? And so it sounds like, and that gets dicey because we still have these moments of being frail humans bumping up against our mortality, and we have fears and the ability to be manipulated. And so we're kind of like oscillating in this phase now where it's like what's really being threatened in what I'm hearing you describe is like what makes us human. And I remember talking to some people back in 2020. One guy who was a medicine man who had spent a lot of time in Central and South America working with different medicine traditions, and he shared this idea that I thought was really interesting. This was back in 2020, and he said there's talk amongst the elders and the indigenous people, and almost like tied into some kind of like prophecy type things that were being spoken about, and it had to do with a bifurcation of the human species. And it really struck me as this, um wow, it stopped me in my tracks. And so as we start to like grapple with a greater amount of not only environmental but like psychological, ideological, like, and then having our physical biological organisms be susceptible to greater levels and amounts of these synthetic type things, whether it's metals or glyphosates or like plastics or like genetically modified things or any types mRNA and all this stuff, which would then create a shift in our resonance pattern, which will then make us more sympathetically resonant with some of the technological powers that be. And so, yeah, I mean that's kind of like where I would where I would plug into what you're saying, is that it's like an all out assault and attack against our what makes us human. And yeah, that's what I got.
thanks. I make a shout out, or quote, not shout out, that's the wrong word. A, um, a call for everyone in this movement to live off grid for us to have on hold sustainable practices for us to survive as humans. I think that is very important to me, and that's why I think you play an important role and in your community, and I appreciate you being here for this discussion. And the other thing is, I don't know how much we can touch on this. You can cut this off, Jay, if you wish, but if I recall, the other area that we were exploring is that you were returning to the basics, rudimentary basics of our children away from tech, which I have nephews I'm trying to help stay away from their AI girlfriends, and also biological connection to our earth and the beauty of the feminine and the masculine spirit that I think we are losing in today's world when it comes to, I think some maybe call it trans movement, or some people might think it's, I don't know, that I currently have now more of a stance where I'm trying to incorporate in my yoga classes male uh, instruction or classes only sessions, and female instruction for some of my other colleagues.
Yeah.
Because I think there is a beauty in also reviving or coming in tune with the male spirit or the female spirit for that community in this space.
Mm.
And do you want to say anything about that in today's climate?
Yeah. Well, going back to the formulation of Ada, that was one of the pieces, another one of the pieces that I didn't bring up earlier. But yeah, it was, JD and I, in some of our conversations, we had kind of come up with this list of things, and we were just calling them the untouchables. And they were like the things that you get the pitchforks and the torches come out if you start to try and talk about these things. And the gender discussion is one of those. And I think that there is, from an alchemical or a metaphysical or a spiritual perspective, there are feminine and masculine principles present within each of us. But to try and uncouple that from our biology is, it's like that's a big responsibility. There's in the description now of the LGBTQ, it's got another thing that's like S2 or 2S in one that I recently saw, and we were like, what's the 2S thing, And so it was two spirited, and so in some of the conversations that I had with either faculty members or prospective families that were interested in becoming part of the Ada community, on a handful of occasions, the topic came up where, people wanted to get some more clarity, or they were in a different place with how they wanted to raise their child. Or there was at one point a staff came on, and they were with the teen group, and they started asking them what their pronouns were. And we were like, okay, so we had to have a whole conversation around that. And so, I said something along the lines of um, biological gender, and I was immediately corrected by this individual that that's not actually the correct term, or that's not an accurate term. And I was like, okay, well, what I'm saying then is that if we are going to take on the role of uncoupling biology and gender, that's a massive responsibility. That's the type of thing where you're splitting the atom in a sense, and you're going to release a charge. So the two spirited concept and idea comes from some of these indigenous cultures, but these were oftentimes the people that walked between worlds.
Yeah.
And our concern with Ada was we're not going to be doing that with small children. If we as adults want to start to get into these things and learn and claim that for ourselves, as a grown adult, that's that's different, but we're not going to like interject this into the mind of a 5-year-old without, because it's like the type of thing where you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen by having kids on screens from the time that they're 2. We don't know yet. And just like with things like mRNA or a lot of the environmental things that are going on, any kind of like genetically modified things, we're starting to tinker into these realms that are like in between the cracks of the fabric of reality. And so, I don't think we as a human culture and society have really proven that we have the maturity to be able to hold that with like dignity and grace. And so I definitely don't think that it's appropriate to introduce that to like school-aged children. Yeah, and I think that part of the problem with these areas is that the conversation gets so charged that it becomes impossible to tease things apart. Um, like you said, if you don't want to include this because it's too controversial, no, but I want to have these conversations, and I think it's important that we do. And I don't have all the answers, but I have what I feel are some valid points and concerns and skepticisms that are based in not in ego or control, but in like actual genuine care and concern for other humans and children.
Hmm.
And so, you know, to me, that seems like if we can find some kind of a common ground in our humanity, we're going to have a greater chance of being able to unravel some of these sticking points that oftentimes lead to like intensity and conflict.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's all the questions I have, but I do think that there are trans comrades that we have, and we should acknowledge them because they're part of, just like I see also people who are Trump supporters. I think of them as comrades as well. There are going to be differences in ideologies all across the working class.
Hmm.
However, the challenge in that for me has been also to acknowledge that there are biological differences. And when I have worked with children, particularly, I stay away from what I know that to be also a political agenda in trying to, I don't know, maybe to impose uh, onto minors or kids, and I have a concern with that. And celebrate also, as we had in an episode last week or 2 weeks ago, celebrate also the fact that there are men and masculine energy, and there's nothing wrong with that. And we can just as well celebrate that as well. And I think we've lost focus um, and the plights that men face as well. The importance of also highlighting their struggles and their strengths, as I try to do in my life with my community, and not ostracize any other person in all of them, the same working class, all the peasant folk that we're all in. So anyhow, I use peasants because it's like I'm talking about us, not people at the elite class, the people at the top.
Right.
That's all my questions. Thank you, Jay. I don't know if you have anything else, Andy. I know that I dominated the last half of this conversation. I apologize, Andrew.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, listening to your questions, Eduardo, and Jay, some of your responses, I feel like there's a little parable that comes to mind. And the thing that you said, you ran into some shaman and they talked about a sense of a bifurcation. That I can't speak to. That's not what I knew about 2020, but I feel like that's as accurate a description of what has been taking place, um, of people being separated from themselves, of each other, uh, and even in this notion that it's digital twinning, where your data is collected and you build a digital presence, an avatar that's going to be used by the government, and you're over here. Like all these things of splits that are just being talked about, and even people being separated from their biology. But I also think that for me, the parable of this talking to you right now has been I experienced and thought about North Carolina in all that debate of and important discussions of, is the government doing right by the people who are experiencing the disaster? Are other people trying to come to their help, and what's happening there? And did somebody else even make the storm happen? And how are corporations going to use this to take lithium or quartz out of the ground and displace people? All those things are meaningful. But within that, in your community, people were coming together and, calmly, or in the heart of the crisis, people were coming together and figuring out what to do about what they were facing. And there was something about that, about all of us out here just kind of losing our minds,
Mm-hmm.
and all of you who actually are facing the thing. And it's not that we aren't facing it, because all of us are afraid. We look at that and we like, what happens when an earthquake happens here? Is this the same thing that's going to happen to us? So I'm not saying that fear is pointless, but I'm reminded that there's a difference between what's actually happening on the ground and how people deal with it on the ground when they are centered in some way, and all this stuff and all these things that, yes, we are afraid of, but at the end of the day, we're still going to be stuck with each other on having to deal with it. There's something about that for me, like that gives me a little bit of hope, because I am afraid of the same things Eduardo is afraid. But I'm even thinking about it, I'm reminded, like, all of us on the outside didn't necessarily know what was going on, but there were people who were actually in it, who were actually finding a solution that was communal and good and brought things together, not apart.
Mm-hmm.
That's meaningful to me.
Yeah. And I mean, when I'm hearing you talk too, it's like I'm hearing you saying the ground, right? And so there was like a huge component to that of just being like able to be connected into the earth and the ground.
Yeah.
And so I mean, that's going to be part of this thing that makes us human. We've got to continue to strive to have some kind of a connection to the ground beneath our feet.
Yeah.
Because that's stabilizing It's on all the different levels through our being.
So I appreciate you sharing this, because I think there's more lessons in it than I thought there might be. Yeah. And I'm looking forward to a larger conversation with you and JD about the Freedom. Oh, what's the name? Freedom Rising.
Sovereign Rising.
Sovereign,
Rising
Sovereign.
Sovereign. Actually, Rising Sovereign.
Rising Sovereign.
Rising Sovereign. I'm looking forward to that as well.
Yeah,
it'd be great to have JD back on and continue all this.
Yeah.
Thank you for the challenge of being here for how long?
2 hours until 10 o'clock at night for this guy.
Oh my goodness! I'm so sorry, Jay.
Oh no, it's okay. It's 11. It's 11 here.
11, oh my God! Look at Steve.
Yeah. Oh, we're good. We're good. This was a delight, honestly.
All right, that's good.
Thank you. So we're going to conclude now, but thank you. Hang on with us for a bit as we wrap up and I do my wrap. All right, well, that does it for this week's episode. Jay, founder of ADA, and I will link that the Academy to this episode, and also host of Rising Sovereign podcast, has joined us. Thank you very much. What's Left is a weekly political podcast / channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes where we found this episode, or on our blog on whatsleftpodcast.com, where you can find us in case we ever get censored or banned anywhere else. You can find us there. You can find past episodes to this podcast / channel there and connect with us as Andy laughs. I remind folks, if you fancy anything you have heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our platforms on Spotify, iTunes, Podcast, BitChute, Odyssey, YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram. You can find our blog and any of those links in the episode notes wherever you found this episode. If you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host Andy Lipson. Thank you very much for joining us, Jay. We look forward to having a future discussion with you again, especially on biology, quantum biology, and all these radical ideas that we've discussed and we'll further explore with you on a separate episode. Check us out for that. Thank you all for listening. Ciao, ciao.